All right. So let's I'll take a minute and answer that question, which was how do you stop Node from running when you already have it running in the background, or npm, right?
Or any other.
Anything. So usually you're not running it in the background. You're doing, let me stop it here, right? You're doing like npm start. So it's running actively in this terminal window, like the one you see right here. And the way you kill anything running in a terminal window in general is Control-C. So you can hit Control-C and it exits out of that and brings you back to the command line or to your prompt. So whenever you're running something and you want to quit running it because you don't want it building the files now, you can just hit Control-C. That'll step you back out. And that works the same on every platform. And if it doesn't work, like if you ever have problems where it's not working, I usually mash Control-C or Control-Z because different apps may behave a little differently. But that usually gets you out of just about everything.
And another question to that as well. Why do we have to keep running the echo command?
Yes, that I'm going to figure out how to get that fixed. What's going on there? You mean, so anytime, what's going on right now for anyone who doesn't know what he's talking about is, you know that echo command that you had to do in order to get everything working? Pretty much anytime your Cloud9 workspace restarts itself in some way, you have to rerun this. And it appears as if you also need to, what other one? Like if you're having Node version problems, then in order to get that fixed, you'll have to redo those, because anything that's global configurations for your workspace, it looks like those don't stay, they get wiped. So you need to configuring stuff globally for that machine that you're running on Cloud9. We need to make those local configurations to your like workspace area as opposed to global. So the reason we're having to do that is because the etc/host file, that's a global file, whereas /home/ubuntu/workspace, like that's your local area. So if I, let me do LA, that. So I believe all the changes you make in this folder like will stay around, whereas ones that are made that are outside of that folder won't persist between Cloud9 sessions. So I need to figure out how to move those settings into your workspace so that they'll persist. It's just, should be pretty small set of changes that we'll need to make to our process for that.
He was helping me remind mine wouldn't start this reason real quick because I just thought I was doing something wrong, but it was putting my first name in double quotes, and when I changed the echo function, not put it in double quotes, now it works.
We just had this problem on Face System. Okay, so I don't know. No. So if you're cutting and pasting on a Windows system, okay, this is going to get into some very technical stuff that you guys have probably never encountered before. There's something that are called smart quotes, and they're horrible. They're horrendous. They're the bane of every software developer who's had to work in stuff that's ended up on Windows systems. I can't even, here, I can show you something that looks like them. So here are straight quotes. These are proper quotes. Like that's what your quote, the double quote thing should put out. But if you look at these are smart quotes, right? This is some sort of curly paired quote. And so it's not actually the same character. Straight quotes, it's a different character. And Windows thinks smart quotes are the best thing ever because look, you can tell that these go together. It's smart, it looks better, it's sharper. And so a lot of times on Windows platforms, it'll try and convert quotes to these smart quotes when you're working with something. And that smart quote character then doesn't work correctly in pretty much any other environment outside of those specific Windows files. And that's how you get burned. If you put in, like, actually type the quote character as opposed to probably cutting and pasting, you probably won't have the same problem. And I'm guessing that's a result of not I could be wrong, but I'm guessing that's a result of this program itself, Slack or whatever, the Windows version, using smart quotes here instead of regular quotes. And so you guys are cutting and pasting smart quotes into your host file, which is not going to be interpreted correctly. Because Linux sees those, it says this isn't a valid like quote character. That command echo doesn't know what to do with the smart quotes, so instead it echoes the whole thing out in between. Faith just had the same problem. We cut and pasted it directly from there, same problem. So that's a complexity that I wasn't even thinking about, and I'll have to look into, hop on my Windows system and see what happens with the Slack app or where that's coming from, maybe. But if you run into that problem, what you can do, and this is just getting into some command line stuff, right? We talked about this in one of the very first days of class. If you want to, let's just look at this command real fast and look at what it's doing so we can break it down a little bit, right? All echo is doing is saying literally echo what I typed in here, right? So let's, I can zoom in some here. I should be able to. There we go. That's pretty big. So if I echo hello, it just puts hello to my console right there. And then if I echo quote hello, it'll still just put hello there. The quotes are just a safeguard so that because if I echo hello world, well, this is going to work for this specific instance because echo is smart. But you can have some problems if you have spaces in it without quotes, and that's really what you're trying to capture with the quotes there, so that it knows how to handle that and isn't doing them as some sort of process command. So that's all that echo command is doing, is it's piping it to something. This sudo, all that means is the super user, because some normal people aren't allowed to change the etc/host file. It's a file that your average user can't do. So if you're on a Windows system and you've ever gotten like that user access control prompt when you try to install a piece of software that you have to click the button on to say, yes, I mean to install this. That's very similar to what you're saying with sudo on a system. You're saying, yes, I am the person who has permission to do this. And as long as you actually do, it'll let you make that change. That way you're protected from accidentally changing files you don't intend to most of the time. What does this T do? All that T did, grab the output of the last command essentially, pipe it into this other command. I don't know if this will even work. Announcement That reconnected. All right, so if you're ever interested in what commands do in Linux, a useful thing to do is just man. It stands for manual. So here T, it says reads from standard input and write to standard output in files. So all that T is doing is grabbing the input from that echo command and writing it to this etc host file. So we can look at that etc host file using anything that views files on Linux. Cat is the simplest one. And you can see here's what it intended to do. It intended to write out 0.0.0.0 and then this line after there. So if you have a problem, like it didn't work, you maybe think you might have the quotes issue, you can check this etc host file. Cat, you could do less. It doesn't matter what you use to look at that file. You know, any tool, they just work differently. And then you'd be able to check and see if it has what you expect it to have, which should be like this 000 mapping to that C9 hostname value. Any other questions or issues? Just ramping those environments up? You'd be surprised how much time you end up spending just trying to get all that stuff working. You'd think like, oh, this should always be easy. You're always going to run into problems like that. Yeah?
So to run it, you go into Camden app, then you do the echo thing, and then you do npm start.
Wherever, it doesn't matter where you are when you do the echo command. But yes, you need to be in the Kanban folder. And before the first time you run it, you also need to run npm install. What npm install will do, if you didn't like notice, is npm install goes and looks at the dependencies, either the dev dependencies, well, both the dev dependencies and these dependencies, and it installs them into this node modules folder. So another time you would need to do that is anytime you add a new dependency, like, oh, I've added another package that I want to use, you need to run npm install to make sure you've installed it and it's going to be available to you. But then once you're in here, you can run npm and either run start or just start. Either way works for start. For every other command, you need to do npm run in the command, so it's probably best to just get used to doing npm run. Any other questions about just getting set up? All right then. Let's, oh, this is not sharing my screen, I don't think, anymore. There we go. So let's talk about the, this implementing a Note application section and start answering questions that people have probably from the very get-go in this area, right? So I hope that this portion right here, before we've even actually copied this code over, this looks relatively familiar, right? So what is this again inside of these curly braces?
Object.
It's just an object, right? And then the square braces? It's an array. So we just have an array of objects. That's all we're doing in this. Yes?
Does that sequence in particular mean anything, or is it just like?
No. That's what's known as a GUID, a globally unique identifier.
Kind of like your server ID, your computer and stuff?
Sort of. So that GUID it's useful because the odds of somebody else ever generating that same identifier with some bit of code that they have is infinitesimal, because each one of these digits is one of 36 possibilities, I believe. It may not be. It might only go up to F. Hold on. B, C, D, E, F. So one of 16. I think A, B, C, D, E, F.
So it's just not identity.
So you can think of it as just, this is actually in a sense just one big number, except it's using hexadecimal instead of decimal. So the numbers can go from 0 to F as opposed to from 0 to 9, like we're used to. So it goes like this. If people aren't familiar with hexadecimal, if you've never encountered it, it's just, all it is you don't have to have, not like every number has to have the same number of possible digits, right? So in binary, there's only 2 possible digits, 0 and 1. And in our decimal 10 base, you have 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And then in that hexadecimal 16, you have this plus A, B, C, D, E, and F. They just, I don't know why they are using that. So you have 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 because of 0. So 16 hexadecimal. And so these are just digits in a hexadecimal language. So this is just a string of numbers, really. And if you want to know the odds of somebody else, like how unique this is, I don't even know how many digits there are in this, but it's, 16 to the power of, or whatever this is, odds of somebody else having that same identifier. So that's all it is. And these were just ones. That's why it switched over later to using that UUID library. So if you did, I don't know if this is going to work. Let me see if this will work. Node. Okay. So when we switch over the code to use this UUID bit, all that's doing is generating a unique one each time you call it. So you can think of it, this is a good breakdown of the most basic thing that we've done, right? Ignore that require statement for a minute, we'll come back to that. Now that I have this UUID, all this UUID thing is an object that we pulled in from someone else. And that object has some functions on it. It's got a v1 and a v4 function on it, right? So the object's called UUID. I want to access the v4 function. I can do it like that. And if I want to call the v4 function, it doesn't take any parameters, so you just call it like you would any other function. That's really all you're doing with it. And it just happens to return this string, which is like this hexadecimal number. Does that make sense? It's the only point of it is to give you a unique identifier so that you'll know what these things are later. So does this make sense so far? That should be comfortable, pretty familiar. The syntax might be different because we're just inlining our objects and stuff, but an array of objects. They talk about some of the interesting ways we can structure data as well, because this is an array. So if I had this, let me go ahead and just, let's copy this into oh, that's not going to work, huh? Maybe that wasn't the right command for copy. Hold on. I did Control C because, oops. I do that by default. I need to do Command C. There we go. So if I copy that into data, we all feel comfortable. How do I access the first item in the array? What? Data 0, right? Yeah. That's all it is right now. And we'll come back and talk more. After you guys get more comfortable building stuff, we'll talk more about different possible ways to structure the data, because I think it'll make more sense later why. There's not much point in introducing other approaches until you begin to see where there would be value in it. So the next step we have is the rendering initial data. Now this is where we sort of introduced a lot of new concepts in here. So hopefully there's a lot of questions or thoughts around this, but anybody have any questions on this bit here? Anything that was new or that you don't understand or? All right, good. So I can't remember, did we talk about ES or JavaScript modules in our last class at all, or maybe just touch on it? So this export and import, these are both related. And what it is you want to be able to build, we've talked about how building an application, you don't want to build it all in one file, right? You want to build it out of a whole bunch of smaller pieces. And how can I build something larger up out of small pieces? So when you're trying to do that, and let's, I'll even go back to this Survive.js thing and I'll muck around in here. So let's create, and it won't be a component. You guys don't need to follow, do this, but let's create a very simple file here. We'll call it log.js. So it's just going to be a JavaScript file. And in this, we're going to create a function called log, and it's just going to take some sort of message. And what we want it to do is log whatever message somebody sends into it. So you were talking, what did we learn before about how to log stuff? Alex, console.log, right? So console.log can be called, and you can call console.log with, look, it's even giving us some help here from our IDE. It's telling us, oh, text or a string of some kind. Well, message is intended to be a string, so we can just call console.log with whatever this message is, assuming it's a string, right? So this is awesome. What I built here, in a sense, is a very, very tiny file that does one thing and sort of encapsulates all of this log function and behavior. And maybe I would even have other things around it, which we might build up in a minute. But this way, if I change how I log in the future, or I don't want to do a console log, I want to make a call to a server and record this in some database somewhere so that we're tracking everything that happens. I could make those changes, but I don't have to necessarily change my other code. So now let's say I want to use this log. I want to call it when this page first starts loading, right? I want to be able to call log running index.jsx. And I've got a problem though, log isn't defined, it doesn't exist for this file, right? So how can I connect these and yet keep my code sort of isolated? Well, what you can do is, here I have a function called log. I can export something from this file, and this is ES6 newer JavaScript syntax, and I can tell it the default export is log. So all this is saying is the default export from this file is this log function.
If you have two functions, you use it the same detail there.
You can only have one default export from a file. I'll talk about that in a minute, which I don't think we get into too much yet. We'll deal with more later in the class when we have some better examples. I can go over it, but so I want to export log. Okay, now anyone want to take a guess how I get that into this file? Makes sense, right? Import, what do I want to import? The log, right, I guess, from log.js, right? What we can see is now it says, I fixed my error here. It's all happy. It feels like log is defined. And if I go to my application, we can see that my log line ran it, console.logged, what I expected. Now, when you're doing default exports in ES6, there's no actual requirement that you name the import the same as what the thing that you exported. Default just means default. And so I could call this something different. I could have said this is console log. It doesn't matter. And as long as I call it that here, it'll still work. Because this isn't tied to the name of that export in the other file. At least. What's that? No, well, what you would do, and we'll talk more about that too. Not necessarily. I'll show you why you were having a problem, which I think is specific to the way the code was written. But the way you would debug anything, let's step away from the one I've imported, right? Let me get rid of this line here, and so I want to see if this file loaded. You could just write console.log. Right. So you can sort of put that just about anywhere in your code, and you should see it. Okay, running index.jsx, right? I'll get into the problem with that I think you were encountering before, because I'll bet you were trying to do this. Rendering app or something, right? And this is going to have an error. And I'll talk about why in a little while, but that's because he wrote stuff.
Because it's not valid JSX.
It's because it's not valid where you're putting it. Right. But we'll talk about how to solve that in a little while. Okay, so we've shown how to do like an import. That's really what's going on with this import and export. So in this, even in this simple example here, what we're exporting default is, and this is a little bit of a new syntax for you, but do you know what this whole thing would just be? That we're exporting? If you were to say it looks like something else, what do you think it looks like? What?
Like the syntax? Or?
Yeah. What sort of what type does this look like we exported? Looks like a function, maybe. Maybe the syntax is a little different than you're used to, but it looks like a function. We've got the sort of parentheses here going on, etc. Right? So let's we can actually rewrite this, and then I'll break it down into how to convert it to this syntax. So I'm going to, I think I have, what point am I at in my app? Sure. So I changed this, I reached the sort of the next step. Let me revert this. There we go. So this is back at this point in the code, where it's just rendering the notes. So we can change this syntax. Let me change it, and then we can talk about the difference between this and the syntax that you might be more familiar with a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and, this is just for example purposes, we'll comment this out. Let's change this to a different syntax. Let's call it a function. And it doesn't take any parameters. And then it's going to a function always returns a value. What does a function return if you don't return a named value? If you don't give it a specific value that a function returns, what does it end up returning? Does anybody remember? We can test this real fast. Let's define function foo. What?
So,
Let's say it logged something. Brand foo. But it's not returning a specific value. So what do we think gets returned by foo when it runs? If you don't return something, it returns undefined by default, right? For normal functions. So there's always a return value. If you don't have an explicit one, it's undefined. Okay, so then we want there to be an actual return value from this function. So let's say this item here is the return value. I'm going to change my indentation just to make it work a little better for what I'm expecting. And now it begins to look a little closer to what you might be familiar with for a function, right? Okay, we've got a function, we've got our, curly braces, we've got a return value of some kind from it. We getting to feel more comfortable with what that looks like? So this is sort of accomplishing the same thing. I can talk about why there's a difference. And now you might begin to see also why, say, console.log might not work. What we've done here, it's not going to be obvious at first, but inside of these parentheses, that's telling you to treat this whole thing as a single expression, that this isn't separate lines of JavaScript, this is one expression. So it would be like, I don't know how to write something very similar that's, I mean, you guys have done stuff similar in, say, an if statement, right? Inside of an if statement, you'll have multiple things. If true and false, and true, right? Or something, whatever, right? So inside of those parentheses, that's saying this is your whole expression all at once. So that's what was going on here with this as well. So if inside of this expression, you try to add just a random line of JavaScript, which I'm like console.log, rendering notes, you're going to have a problem because you can't just insert a line of JavaScript in the middle of an expression. But we could take this line and put it right here, for example. And that should work for us. So now, Webpack failed to compile. What is it yelling at me for? I may ask you guys to disable some of these linting rules because some of these are way too picky. Oh, I don't need a semicolon at the end of a function. That's right. So now it worked, and you can see my console.log does get logged out, rendering notes. So if you're trying to add debugging or something like that, that's sort of how you would do it. But if you tried to add it just right in here in the middle of this JSX, you would have a problem, which is, I'm guessing, what you were encountering. Is that right?
I think it was the way
At the end of it?
Yeah.
So like here?
Yeah.
You'd still have the same problem. As long as you're within those parentheses, you're going to have that issue, right? Now the question is, wait a minute, well then how, now let's talk about some of the differences between these two function syntaxes, right? So this syntax that we have up here is what is known as a fat arrow syntax. This is also a newer JavaScript syntax for functions. And it does a few things to simplify the behavior of functions so you can write stuff more concisely. If it was up to me, I wouldn't have written this tutorial with these to try and have you guys keep working with the same syntax of functions so you wouldn't have to learn something new. But let's talk about fat arrow functions for just a moment. So if we were to write, let's take our foo type function that we had before, and let's make it a fat arrow function instead. Fat arrow being this equals arrow sign. Or let's actually let's do it with our log.js as well, but I'm gonna do a few small examples up here first. So let's do a foo one. And let's have it, it's going to take in some sort of number. And then I'm just gonna say num here. And if I call foo with 5, it returns 5. And if I call foo with 2, it returns 2. And does that behavior look different than the way other functions operated? There should be something weird about that. Let me define bar here and see it. So we have bar as a function. And it also takes a number. All I do is say num inside of it. Now if I call bar with 5, or bar with 2, does it look like we're getting a different result from the two different types of functions? Yeah? What's the difference?
You're saying first one to equal to the number. I did that expressions thing with the little bracket. The other one is just not calling anything.
This one actually isn't calling anything either. But
I feel like it's defining.
what we're seeing here is not assignment, but what's returned from our function, right? Because what did I say gets returned from a function that doesn't have an explicit return value? Undefined, except what's getting returned from foo? 5. So that's one of the big differences between a fat arrow function and not, is on a fat arrow function by default, in a sense, the last thing evaluated in it is what's returned. So let's redefine foo here. And some people who are familiar with Ruby might say, oh, this feels nice and comfortable. I'm familiar with this. This is how Ruby functions work. The last thing evaluated is what's returned. Yay. So let's add some parentheses because we can have them in this. Oops, I screwed up. I want foo to take a parameter, number, and then let's have it do some things. I don't care. Let's have it do num, and then let's do num plus num, and then so now if we call foo with 2, I lied. I thought that's the way it worked. I think you explicitly have to return something unless you, if it has parentheses, you actually have to have a return value. But if you write it without the parentheses, you don't have to have a return value for a fat arrow function. So see, I was wrong.
So the returning of a value is kind of like you're assigning a variable as opposed to like a constant.
It's just, I mean, it's really just a simple shorthand so that the fact that it returns that value, if you only give it a value, like an expression to evaluate, as opposed to a block. So curly braces define a block of some kind. And so if you give it a block, then it won't return, whatever you evaluate, like the last thing. But if you just give it some expression, then it'll return whatever you evaluated. So if I redefine foo again, one more time, and this time again, I'll just give it an expression. Let's return num plus num. And if I call foo with 5, it's returning 10. And that's because all I gave it was an expression. If I use curly braces, a block, it won't return that. You'll have to do an explicit return value. So it's just because we're lazy. Programmers are lazy and don't want to type out extra stuff. And they're like, oh, I hate having to always do a return value. And all I want is a simple function. When all I wanted was square, which is a very simple function that takes a number and returns number times number. I'm lazy. I want to be able to write it that way as opposed to having to write function like square, number, return num times num in my parenthesis. All right, it does the same thing. Because we're really lazy and we don't want to have to type all that out, we made this other shorthand notation. But then it can trip you up as well. And there's a lot of variance on the way that these fat arrow functions work. So you'll see the syntax vary a fair bit in different domains. The other thing is, again, those parentheses, that just means evaluate this whole expression and return the result of evaluating that whole expression. So if I were to redefine square fat arrow function again, and this time I just used parentheses and I said num times num, and I want to return that. That works the same as the way I had written it before. Those parentheses were just telling it this is all one expression. Evaluate this as one expression, as opposed to breaking it up into different expressions. And that only really comes into play when you're being super lazy, like they were in this tutorial, and they don't want to have to write this whole thing out separately. So they just said return. Here's a function, return the result of evaluating this expression, and this expression is this bit of JSX. You know, if we wrote that out in a more long form way, we could easily return this still and add our curly brace here and like indent all of this. And this would be the same. And then if we wanted to make it maybe even a little more verbose, we could set some sort of variable here. So we could say var return like component, I don't know, equals. And these parentheses, those aren't necessarily required. You could write all this on one line. So let's do that real fast just so I can show that. I'm going to be super lazy again. Let me grab all of this. You could write it like this instead. And then return component. And this would be ultimately the same thing. It's going to run that code and return that component. And so the return value might be a little easier to understand in this version of typing it, but I would argue that this JSX is a lot harder to read, right? It's all on one line. It's hard to know what the format is, the structure. So if you want to break a single line of, like a single expression onto multiple lines in JavaScript, the way you do that is you use curly braces to help you break it out onto multiple lines, because until that brace ends, the JavaScript interpreter knows this is all one expression. So what we've done now is said, oh, here's one whole expression, or this is the start of an expression right here. And until you see the in parenthesis, the rest of it is all part of the same expression or the same statement or whatever. And so that way I can format it to make it read a little easier. That's really all that's for. And now we could do this, components. And that's also the same code. Renders the same thing. In fact, you can actually see it tell you nothing changed. That's because when it compiles down, it's saying you didn't change anything compile-wise, nothing changed from the output. It looks different to us, but the output file is the same. Does that make sense on this fat arrow function and what it's doing? Yeah? Ask questions. There's other stuff in there that I would, be surprised if people didn't have questions on. like I say, we can go until about 8, and we'll just keep working through this as long as it needs to take. Because I feel like there were a lot of different concepts introduced here. What did people think of this notes.map call? Was that weird to anybody how all that worked? Were you able to understand that, or any questions?
That's a class of notes, right?
What?
The map.
So what is notes? Notes is this right here, right? So what is notes? An array of objects, right? So again, this is me breaking the code down into what, to me, when I think about stuff one bit at a time, it can be easier to understand, right? So you can see there's a lot of code here that was all on one line. Well, look, I just rewrote this instead, and now I have this component. Well, that's a little easier for me to think about what I'm returning now, because when I read my return, I don't have all this extra stuff. But I still have a lot going on in here. So maybe I can break this down into some separate lines so that it's smaller and easier for me to reason about as well, right? So I don't know if people remember, inside of JSX, if you want to have some JavaScript in the middle of your JSX, that's when you use these curly braces. That's telling JSX, hey, here's some JavaScript. So maybe let's pull that JavaScript out instead. Let's create another variable. Let's call them the notes. And let's just straight up grab this line of code. Take it out, put it up here, and replace it down here with notes. So all I did there was a line of code that was being run, and whatever the result of running this notes.map code was getting put into our JSX. Well, I didn't want to have it inline there. I think it's easier for me to reason about separately. So I just assigned it to a variable, the result of running that. And then I just inline that variable into my JSX instead. And I blew up. What did I break here? Cannot read property map of undefined. Oh, I know what's wrong. I can't call this, yeah, I need to call this something else because I overrode the variable name. I lost access to my external one. Note elements, what I'll call it. Note elements, all right. So now we should run, now I should build. I couldn't name it the same as notes because I already had notes out here. And so I lost access to my notes object. I created a conflict, a naming conflict. But does that make sense, just being able to pull that out like that? This is a great way. I'm sort of teaching you what I would say are like debugging tools or ways to break code down when you're thinking about it. Try and break it down into smaller and smaller pieces. Think about the smallest piece you can and then build it up out of those again. So now I've got a smaller piece. Okay, now we have notes.map. And it's doing something here. All right, what does this maybe look somewhat similar to? Looks like HTML, but if we were to call this a JavaScript type of some kind, what does it look like? Maybe a function, a fat arrow function? Well, we introduced yet another slight syntax change on it because why not keep messing with syntax? In the case that here we don't have parentheses, we just have this note line, right? I'm going to replace this. That's if you only have one property you're passing into a function. For a fat arrow function, you can write it that way. But to me, it's still easier to think about it this way. Parentheses, note, in parentheses. That's very similar to, we had our square function here, right? Parentheses num. Well, if we had, let's say we want to have a subtract function. Then you'd need 2 arguments, right? Or let's say add. Because I can't remember what the actual arguments are called in subtraction. Does anybody remember what they're called? No. So what are they called in addition? They're called, I don't remember my math. Num1, num2. I don't remember what they're actually called. They're not operands, are they? And so this will just return, right? Num1 plus num2. So this is really just a function signature. And those are your arguments. That's what was going on here, except when you're doing fat arrow functions, you can be super, super lazy if it takes just 1 argument. Like this square one I had before, I could write this way instead. Again, programmers are lazy. Num returns num times num. That's exactly the same as, like, this line is exactly the same as this, except I only have this 1 argument, so I didn't even have to use parentheses. The only problem is I think it makes it hard to read your code because you end up having to look for different types of things and say, oh wait, that's a function too. That's a function too. So I like to put the parentheses around stuff to trigger my own mind. Oh, this is a function call. So we've got another function here of some kind, right? Well, let's just break this out. Let's keep breaking stuff out. Var make note, create note. Let's just call it that. And I'm going to grab this function here and move it up here. And then I'm going to change this notes.map and just pass in the function name instead that I just created. So now let's check. This is sort of the cycle I use when I'm working on something. Oh, yep, looks like it's still rendered correctly. And if I'm unsure if it refreshed, I can do a forced refresh on it. Yeah, looks like it's working. My build passed. So all I did there was, again, pull something up another layer, right? Pull it out so I have a smaller piece of code to look at each point in time. And I'm building something larger up out of it. So now we've got something, all right. This looks similar or familiar. A function that's just returning some HTML or some JSX. It's just some more JSX. And it gets called with a note or a something, and that note has, it's an object that has an ID and a task. And those are just being inserted there as the ID and task for it. Does this make sense so far? So breaking it down, walking through. Is it useful to break it down like this? Yeah. I'd recommend, like, if you guys are questioning this stuff, I recommend doing the same thing while you're working on the code. It doesn't have to look the exact same way that they have it, because they're writing a very dense bit of code. It could be broken down in this line-by-line structure that is easier to think about each piece one at a time. So now, okay, well, this function sort of makes sense. It takes some sort of object which has an ID and a task and spits out some JSX. But what's going on with this .map? This is something I didn't really introduce in our other class, but arrays, we talked about how arrays have some methods on them, right? So, like, I think we may have done the for each on an array as a way to iterate over each item in an array. Mapping is very similar. And this gets into what's known as functional programming concepts. And all map does is, you know, it's very similar to an eraser. It's very similar to a function, literally a function for math, right? Like if you're used to f of x in math, and that it's x plus 5, if x equals 3, what's my result? 8, right? Okay. And let's say x is 5. 10, right? Very simple. Well, what map does is it's the same sort of thing. You tell it, here's a function. The only difference is map is part of an array. So you give it an array of inputs. You can imagine it being like an array of these x values. So 1, 2, 3, 4. And then I tell it dot map. And we were just writing this square function a minute ago, right? So let's use the square function, and I'll inline it here, even though that can be confusing. We'll use the same fat arrow notation. Num times num is what we're going to return from it. And so what you get as a result of running this is it's going to step over each item in this array and pass it in as the value to the function that you gave it as a parameter. And then it's going to give you a new array having stepped over each item in that array. So the result of having run this will be what is 16? Because it just applied that function to each one and created a new array having applied it on each argument in there. Does that make sense? So I can show that up here really easily, right? 1, 2, 3, 4. Dot map. We already defined square. So instead of me redefining it, I can just pass that function in, and I get 1, 4, 9, and 16. So it stepped over each item in that array, ran the function on it, and generated a new array from that result. Yeah, because let's break that down. What did we give it? We passed in an array, which has 2 items, 2 objects, yep. But really all that matters is 2 items. And then it calls this function for each one of them, creating this bit of running this bit of JSX code and returning it. So then the result of having run that is now an array, and we can log this to prove it. Console.log note elements. So let's see what we get here. We have an array, and there's a whole bunch of stuff going on here, but 2 of these JSX objects is the key bit. And so you guys don't have to understand all of this, but 2 React components essentially is what we get back. Right, the first one being learn React, and the next one being our do laundry or whatever. So that's what came back are 2 React components, which we just tell it to render inside of here, this array, and React knows how to render an array of elements, which is nice. It's a nice thing that it gives us. We don't have to break them out and write them one by one. React says, oh, I can take an array of these and render all those out. And that's how you sort of get that first set of notes to come out. There's a lot of little moving pieces there and a lot of things that we've introduced for the first time. But nothing fundamentally different than what we learned in our previous class. It's sort of just building some pieces up. Yeah, looks like you had a question?
So I remember in JavaScript you were saying that you have objects where you just have a template, you just have the information being put in, and my curiosity was why we broke down 2 objects. Was it just because of the way we wanted the code to work, or could you do a template and just have parts going? Or is my way off base?
Potentially you could. It would depend on what you're trying to do. You could think of that. We're sort of doing that, right? That's very similar to what this is right here. This looks like a template of some kind, okay? A list item element, and then we're putting in whatever the ID is and whatever the task is the body of this.
And that's just because it's easier for you to do that than line, like you would in HTML if you were just doing it one by one.
Right. And because you can now programmatically do it and you don't have to know how many you have. So when we add another note, you don't have to change your code, right? It'll automatically generate stuff for the new one. So you can think of each one, like the render from a React component is really just a template output. You may have a lot of other stuff in there, but that's a template. This is a template. Or, you know, it may have different syntax, it may work a little different. It's not the same as a JavaScript like string literal template type thing, but it's a template very much in the same way. Doing something very similar. And a lot of this, if we want to, if we really want to simplify this, we can pull a good chunk of this out of here too. Because this is what's known as a functional component in React, which means we didn't create, like before we were doing the like create class or react.create class or different syntax. This is a component, but it's just a function that returns stuff like that. We can even make this simpler so that it looks more like just a template that's being run. And that's part of why all of it was inlined before, so it looks a little more template-y, but we could break this down more like this. So let's create a function up here, or even just var create note. I'm going to be super lazy. I'll just pull this line out. Why rewrite it when I don't have to? Now I move create note up here. But that's fine because it's still accessible within here. And since it doesn't have any dependency on any properties of this function, I think this will work. Let's see. Sure enough, that works. So that helped us simplify this a little bit. And we could even say, if we wanted to, create notes. I don't know. And this is a function, and it's going to take some notes array, and it's going to return notes.map create note. We're not getting a lot out of this, but all right, now we can, if we want to, we can change this syntax just a little to call create notes with notes. I probably can't use notes in here, can I? Because it'll blow me up again. So items, I'm just renaming this internally. Items, even though that's not the best name. So now we sort of get our note elements this way maybe. And I think this will work. And now, we don't need this log necessarily. Now, we don't really need to assign this to a variable up here. Why not just call that right in here? Create notes, pass in the notes. And now we've gotten back to something that looks sort of similar to what we had before, but we've pulled a lot of the logic out, so it's not even defined inside of that render. And that lets this thing be really simple, and these functions live sort of independently. All of this are just different ways to sort of write the same thing, and whichever one makes it easier for you to think about stuff is the best strategy for you, in my mind.
So if I like me, if I understand the breaking down each part, that's okay. You can still get the same end result. You just learn over time. Like the modulus that you did on the board, he did it with an if else statement, but then you use that code quicker.
Yeah. And actually, I'll tell you an honest truth that takes a long time to realize in programming is it takes a long time in programming to learn to write code that is easy to read. So one of the most interesting characteristics of sort of programming in general is when you read code from somebody who's written a lot of code, especially in that concept in that area a lot of times, it might be really easy to read and sort of understand. And you'll be like, oh man, that's so simple. And then when you go write things like me, you end up with just convoluted things and nested functions and stuff that doesn't make sense, and it's really hard to parse out. That's what's going to happen to you when you're first learning things.
So is it normal at this point for the simple code to seem a little bit more complicated than the complicated code?
It can be. Yeah, like you mean if we're calling this the simple code? Yes, it can be. And I think personally, I don't love, this is a pattern that a lot of people do, like this type of stuff. I prefer breaking stuff down like this. And I think there's a lot of value to it. If you were, and I won't get into too much of this, well, maybe we'll touch on testing somewhere at the end of this class, but if you were to try and test this code piece by piece, you want to test just about the smallest portion you can. And the way this is written, I have to be testing a lot of things all at once. It looks like not much, but there's a lot of things I'm testing. Oh, I'm testing that notes map works. I'm testing that the result from a notes map is, these list items. I'm testing that the UL is done here. I'm testing that notes have an ID and a task, because I can't break it down. I can't test smaller pieces, right? But if I were to try and test things here, well, I can test a single note. Like I don't even have to call the rest of this code if I wanted to. I can call this one line and see what the output is and test just that little bit, which helps me isolate a problem. Oh, it's not all these other things that are going wrong. It's something in this one line here. I can test that this just takes an array and calls map. Like, that's easy. I can test that this just renders stuff and calls this other function. It's really easy. So by having it broken down like that, I think it's really valuable myself. I prefer styles like this where you sort of minimize the bit of code that's inlined. Now, where I would do something different probably myself if I'm writing this is I would probably at this point go back to this, because now I've pulled out almost all the complexity, and so I feel like it's fine to just automatically return this UL and the other line of code in there. I'm not doing a lot of things in there anymore. It's much easier, but it doesn't really matter one way or another. I don't know if I went too deep into this one section here. I felt like it was the first time we touched on some of this, so I wanted to really dive into a lot of these different aspects. So then, the rest of this, it's a lot of similar patterns. You're doing some imports, you're doing some building of things. And so, yeah, I think, again, what I'd like to do is just encourage people to try and get through this. I don't think we'll try and push necessarily on this. If other people do, that's awesome, and we can talk about some future ones. But if people get into deleting notes and understanding React components, more power to you. It sounds like as a class, we're probably still going to be on this implementing a note application section for the next one, but I really want you to try and push through that, so maybe we can finish talking about it and move on to like deleting for the class afterwards. Does that make sense? Yeah? Awesome.